Thinking back on the GBA's available titles, it's apparent that there are many underrated classics that failed to secure time in the spotlight given the DS had usurped the GBA as Nintendo's dominant handheld back in the early 2000s. Despite the disparity in popularity between the two consoles, I'm a firm believer of appraising the contents of the purple landscape of happiness as Metroid Fusion, Golden Sun, and Royal Land 4 were covered in fine detail before. With The Legend of Zelda, Minish Cap, developed by companies Capcom and Flagship in 2004, being the subject of today's analysis. Titles you never even knew existed seems to be a phrase that best describes a majority of the GBA's library, but the lack of recognition from fans doesn't necessarily expand in full on the game's quality. What I'm trying to say is that Minish Cap is yet another solid entry to the franchise family tree of Zelda, boasting an interesting combination of gameplay mechanics and lore. And although it isn't as hard-hitting as A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds per se, it'd be remiss of me to suggest that it's anything less than good. The events that precede the adventure are relayed through stained glass windows, no different from how churches paint religious narratives through the same manner of artistry, and when we think about the region of Hyrule, one whose people are reverent towards deities and matters of sacred significance, telling the story through these decorations fits perfectly, at least for me. They paint the century-old story of how a land consumed by darkness's influence was restored to harmony when the Picori, a race of microscopic people, gifted a young boy with the blade of light that would put an end to their realm's evil. Fast forwarding to the present where we'd see these incidents soon recreated, Zelda gleefully drags Link to a festival, and I have to say, seeing this more outgoing take on Zelda was a breath of fresh air. Usually she maintains a dignified exterior which is befitting of the Princess of Hyrule, but in Minish Cap she's energetic, dashing from stand to stand in her excitement, which I thought lent itself to a more lighthearted take on this character. Anyway, turmoil breaks out when a diabolical sorcerer named Vaati enters the castle, shatters the sacred Picori blade, releases a swarm of monsters into the world, and petrifies Zelda. The king obviously assigns Link the task of resolving all these issues, which is ideal because now we get to bite into the meat of the gameplay. Our adventure is carried out from a top-down perspective, defeating enemies and traveling between separate rooms on a two-dimensional plane. Worlds in 2D Zelda are generally extensive, allowing you to venture off the outlined path and secure pieces of heart containers that increase your health for every 4 you collect, rupees, which is the main currency, and other viable resources. The allure of intrigue and discovery is what drives the gameplay, often rewarding players upgrades to their weapons or other welcome improvements to their arsenal for their unbending curiosity in uncovering the world's depth. Even if an area is sequestered given you lack the appropriate gadget, simply make a mental or physical note of that roadblock and return when you're properly equipped. Those roadblocks facilitate suspense in a way as they get you to ponder what tool will assist in overcoming an inaccessible location, and whether or not the actual device is amazing or lame is dependent on preference or how high you set your expectations. The worldly layout encourages memorization of those finer details, soon hoping you return to find out what it is you couldn't unlock when you were in your weaker state. You know those moments in video games where you go, wow, maybe I can use this weapon to scale that cliff at the beginning of the game. It ends up working, and you're recompensed with the heart container, an item that boosts your longevity in battle? That satisfaction in seeking out the subtleties of the game's design without being told to is what makes 2D Zelda endearing, because it accents how much stronger, smarter, and diversified you've grown to become as a player. In Minish Cap, however, Kinstones are among said game's exclusive additions, checking off on the novelty box and little of anything else, since they damage the gameplay more often than enhancing it. The idea is to collect a shard and combine it with the other half that an NPC possesses. This in turn triggers a random event in the overworld, whether it's a newly accessible cave entrance, unlocking a shop for more Kinstones, and various other side quests. When a player doesn't commit to collecting Kinstones, most of Hyrule's subtle caverns and objects are locked away from you, and regardless of whether or not you're aware of a secret being there, interacting is meaningless because the Kinstone event is required by design to be granted access. And say you adhere to Kinstone Gathering, this is the tedious process expected of you. Collect Kinstones, some of which are attained through chests, randomly dropped by killing enemies or slicing grass, navigate back to an NPC to fuse them. Keep in mind that whatever Kinstone NPCs have is completely luck-based and varies depending on your position in the story. Most of the rewards granted are additional Kinstones, which borders on what is seemingly filler content rather than a well-thought-out quest, and rupees, money attached to a purpose that fades into obscurity as the player nears mid to late game. In essence, if one aspires to gather Kinstone pieces, they're diving into a string of cumbersome tasks that spawn prizes across the world that range from useful to useless on a whim, while if the player neglects Kinstones, they'll be traversing a Hyrule heavily devoid of mysteries, side activities to embark on, and most importantly, that note-taking and discovery aspect that I outlined earlier would be completely null and void. Both options inhibit Minish Cap because the amount of mandated extra steps is quite unfulfilling, bizarre for a franchise designed around open-ended exploration that is supposed to provide you with optional terrain to investigate and think on from the beginning. And honestly, I think there were much better ways the developers could have handled this mechanic. However, looking past this critical flaw, Minish Cap succeeds in several other areas, most notably in its stellar dungeon design and Minish shrinking mechanic, both serving as high points that play their parts in bandaging the wounds that the Kinstone annoyances created. The Overworld is the avenue through which you access the dungeons, a series of trials and grueling enemies blended into a series of interconnected rooms and floors. Scattered throughout these territories are small keys utilized to crack open locked doors, maps and compasses to aid navigation, a boss key that unlocks the mastermind's quarters, and more often than not, a mandatory dungeon-specific item which assists in solving puzzles. Placing emphasis on that last part, I'd like to go over Minish Cap's inclusions and how its required gadgets contribute to this adventure's joys. Bombs and arrows are rudimentary Zelda tools and are thus considered free spaces, but the Gust Jar's role in the Deepwood Shrine and further is interesting. A propulsion device capable of absorbing and expelling air sees use in a variety of styles, such as guiding a lily pad through water, shooting monsters or objects across a given room, knocking giant choo-choos off balance, or dispelling magical barriers shrouding Vadi's floating eyes. Gust Jar is roped into several intriguing puzzles, and I found that it very easily secured a place as my favorite item. Cave of Flames has Cane of Pachi, a wand reliable for flipping objects and creating pockets of energy and pitfalls that catapult Link to newer heights. Cane of Pachi was okay, not exactly interesting, but not bad. Pegasus Boots' primary role is dashing across the Castor Wild swamps, which were untraversable otherwise. They function as a serviceable movement option, but when rolling grants a more fluid change of directions and doesn't require a startup animation, I began to forget that this item existed. Moments provide you the tools needed to dig through the Fortress of Winds amongst the numerous other substances in Hyrule. They're okay. Flame Lantern. It melts ice, widens visibility within darkened spaces, lights torches, and most interestingly demotes Gibdos to Stoutful status. A lantern isn't exactly innovative, but again, it's okay. Rockscape was fascinating to me because we usually don't have conventional jumping buttons in Zelda games, rather climbing or hopping is carried out when one walks off a surface or approaches a piece of terrain. Developers worked Rockscape into the Palace of Winds in ways that placed emphasis on light platforming, which I thought was a riveting subversion of the more puzzle-focused gameplay that preceded it. Overall, a lot of the tools don't stand out to me aside from Rockscape and Gust Jar, but the dungeons themselves are incredibly well designed, and where Minish Cap lacks in quantity of dungeons, it suffices in each individual dungeon's quality. Entering them, you're greeted with an underlying sense of dread conveyed through the music, architecture, and monsters. However, that uncertainty slowly creeps away as you grow acquainted with your surroundings. Doors are initially locked off, but as one explores the multiple rooms amongst vertical layers, processing how the area's layout loops in on itself as one backtracks, or creating additional openings to explore while overcoming monster hordes, it becomes all the more satisfying to get through it. In time, paths around these hindrances will present themselves, and ultimately routes within these intricately structured dungeons become easier and easier to navigate via your items. Deepwood Shrine's use of the Gust Jar was sweet, serving as a fairly light yet absorbing introduction to the journey. Big Green Choo Choo was a satisfactory fight, although I wish it added flavor via multiple phases. Cave of Flames features gliding over stretches of lava, riding in speed limit defying minecarts, walking across crumbling surfaces and creating new pathways via blowing up walls. At the same time, I found it hilarious that enemies are designed similarly to that of the Mario series like Bob-Bombs or Spiny Beetles, reminiscent of blue shells. Gleerock as a boss was passable and I wanted to see it fleshed out more, but his reptilian-like appearance completed by a slick color scheme lends itself to an incredibly memorable monster. Fortress of Winds was fine, utilizing the Gust Jar to propel Bob-Bombs was nice, and yes, that's literally their name. I don't know if this was intentional or a misunderstanding on Capcom's part. The moments, on the other hand, were just alright though, like I said before, but the boss was phenomenal. More on that later. Not really a fan of ice physics as demonstrated in Temple of Droplets, as contrary to a game like Super Mario Galaxy where the same terrain augments movement, it creates slippery, inhibited controls. It wasn't frustrating like the ice ruins in A Link Between Worlds though, and the big Octorok fight was great. Although Royal Crypt is absurdly short and I don't really consider it a self-contained dungeon, it's alright. Palace of Winds was a thrilling soar through the skies where, although I felt it went on for longer than it needed to, it explored the Rock's Cape and gliding mechanics and flying across large openings in satisfactory ways. There's something about this elevated setting that complemented moving about the clouds that made me feel larger than life, literally, at my highest points of the adventure both altitude-wise and thematically before the concluding interaction with the antagonist of it all. It reminds me of Sky Sanctuary from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which I love for the exact same reasons. Platforming atop a Georg pair while slashing away at their eyes was such an exciting set piece to finish off this segment of the game, and they also employ one of Minish Cap's central mechanics which I'll elaborate on later. Dark Hyrule Castle is an amalgamation calling all of the pieces of your arsenal to action in the final challenge, and while I do feel it's oversaturated with Darknet mini-bosses, its dreary colors and atmosphere reminded me a lot of A Link to the Past, which I really liked. Beyond being neatly crafted, Minish Cap's dungeon roster generally shares two elements in common: Minish shrinking mechanic alongside the cloning technique. Picori, aka Minish, are a race of microscopic people that serve as the main draw of this game in terms of lore, with scaling down to their size being made possible by your bird cat partner Eslo. Magical pedestals strewn about the world allow Link to shrink at a moment's notice, granting us a view of the world from an insect's perspective. For example, enemy interactions include crawling inside Armos to disarm or activate them, or infiltrating Mazal and Vadi's disjointed arms, which made those fights amazing. Additionally, substances like puddles and blades of grass that would normally be harmless to us are death traps for smaller creatures, and honestly I love being able to perceive the world through a different lens because our pre-established ideas of what is safe and what isn't is flipped on their heads. A valuable dimension of exploration is provided to Minish Cap's design because of this, rotating barrels via running in opposing directions to access its openings, climbing on top of desks, moving up to the ceiling and knocking down books, and many more ideas worked into the dungeon design made me aware of the tiny intricacies of Hyrule. How small Picori colonies make homes for themselves in between bookshelves and within small crevices at the side of mountains. These races are seemingly invisible forces at play that assist the humans in their day-to-day affairs, such as how Picori helps the shoe shop owner craft his footwear. Although Minish Cap doesn't flesh out his world building through enriching dialogue or a tight narrative, and I can understand complaints levied against the game in those regards, I found that the environmental storytelling is just as effective. Races such as Forest, Town, and Mountain Picori contribute to the culture that surrounds them in interesting ways, and we're given the opportunity to interact with these cute little creatures, fabled organisms of Hyrule whose existence can only be surmised through historical folklore through a gameplay mechanic which is shrinking down to their level. The Minish aren't surrounded by a cruel, oppressive backstory like the Twilight, nor are they tightly bound to tradition or tribal activities. No, the Picori are intuitive civilizations that lead peaceful lives alongside humans, even relishing their role in playing behind the scenes. It's okay that they're simplistically written because it benefits the loosely enforced narrative while also giving you light context on the people around you. Ultimately, more tangible depth is added to the journey through this Minish shrinking beyond merely being a fun gameplay mechanic. Returning to the Sanctuary with elemental stones intact imbues the blade with the ability to create copies of yourself when standing above these magical tiles. Increased strength needed to push large boulders, dispatching multiple targets at once, or simultaneously pressing buttons are among the feats capable using this technique, and a variety of simple yet interesting trials that require bits of mental work are birthed from this power-up. Clones are bound by a meter that depletes over time, while taking damage or leading them into walls will cause them to disappear. It's because of this that care must be exercised in maneuvering around dangers on top of acting fast so as to get in good hits. The Four Swords cloning has applications that smoothly fit into the world design and bosses, something worthy of note that I deeply appreciate Minish Cap for. Before we wrap up for today, I wanted to explore more of my minor issues concerning this game. Button mapping. The GBA is fairly confined in terms of its control scheme, and Minish Cap exacerbates this limitation. Weapons can only be mapped to A and B, which is a major problem because constantly alternating between weapons is warranted at each and every layer of the adventure. Needing to reopen the menu to equip what you need because of the mere 2 slots there are is a minor annoyance, especially because you'll typically want the sword, the most reliable weapon, on B and a secondary item on A. What's even worse is that fusing kinstones with NPCs is mapped to L and rolling is on R. I would have easily deleted either of these two features for more space and smoother gameplay. Kinstones could have been an additional dialogue option selected with A, and maybe roll could have been a double tap of the D-pad in a given direction? Inability to slash pots until a technique is learned from a swordsmaster, which is extremely bizarre considering the animation is the exact same. The library collecting quest is blatant padding in a game that was fairly well paced and of adequate runtime otherwise. Rather than outlining all 3 missing books at once so you can complete all the objectives at once and return in fewer trips, you're forced to tread back to the library to receive a mission briefing one by one, which is kind of annoying. Charming adventure at its core, Minish Cap was an entertaining time, partially because this game is so rarely talked about that I went in completely blind. A solidly constructed 2D Zelda is the best way I can describe it, and yeah, it's overshadowed by harder hitters in A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, but Minish Cap explores amusing gameplay concepts that are worthy of documentation. It's a mechanically interesting entry, from the Minish shrinking mechanic giving this odyssey another layer of explorative depth, to the cloning technique implemented in the puzzles, both of which merged to create interestingly crafted dungeons as expected of the Zelda franchise. Items were generally okay. Gush Jar and Rock's Cape were nice, but the Cane of Pachi, Flame Lantern, Mole Mitts, and the Pegasus Boots were fine, but not exactly evocative. In terms of dungeon bosses, every Eldritch abomination was fun to fight, although I was left wanting more after defeating some of them. The Kinstone gimmick hurting the structure of the game's world, restrictive button mapping, and the library book fetch quest are among the major plagues that hold back this game, but regardless, Minish Cap remains an unforgettable adventure. Plenty of novelty and charming ideas are on display within this game. I want to see the Picori races, Minish shrinking mechanic, Eslo and his witty humor, or maybe Vadi's backstory further expanded upon in any of their potential returns to contemporary Zelda, whether it's in the form of a renewed purpose or even a reference. A man can dream, but you know what? Imagination is a precious thing, and when I think about Minish Cap's impact on me, traces of a magical adventure were given a platform to flourish on the Game Boy Advance.